Hey guys, tonight's journey takes us back to a slower world, the dimly lit streets of medieval Europe, where the smell of fresh bread floated through narrow alleyways and the warm glow of a baker's oven was one of the few lights still burning before dawn. You can almost hear it, the quiet rustle of flour sacks, the rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded, and the faint creak of a wooden door as another sleepy apprentice drags himself into the chill morning air. In this world, bread wasn't just breakfast, it was survival. It fed cities, determined prices, and kept the peace between the hungry poor and the powerful nobles. But it also came with rules, strict, unyielding, and for many bakers terrifying rules. Because in medieval Europe, baking wasn't just an art. It was a legal responsibility. Every loaf was watched, weighed, and sometimes used as evidence in court. The people of the Middle Ages had a saying, "A light loaf means a heavy punishment," and they meant it. The town officials, known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, had one job: to make sure bakers didn't cheat their customers. Bread had to be sold at a fixed price and a fixed weight depending on the cost of grain that week. If wheat was expensive, bakers had to make smaller loaves for the same price. If wheat was cheap, the loaves had to be bigger. The rule was clear: profit was allowed, but greed was not. And if you broke that rule, even by accident, the punishment could be harsh. Imagine this. You've been awake since midnight, your hands raw from kneading. The oven is too hot, the flour a little damp from the rain that week, and by morning the bread comes out lighter than the official standard. When the inspector weighs your loaves, they fall short by a few ounces. You know what happens next. You're dragged before the town hall, your bread cart is overturned in public, and your loaves, your hard work, are burned or thrown to the pigs. Some bakers were even put in the pillory, locked in the town square while people threw stale crusts at them, all because the bread went wrong. But the story isn't all about punishment. It's also about trust. Bread was such a central part of life that people depended on their local baker not just for food, but for honesty. In a time before refrigeration, before supermarkets, before even accurate scales, the baker's word was a matter of faith. A good baker could be beloved, their shop a hub of the community. A bad one could spark riots. That's why bakers formed guilds, early trade unions that controlled who could bake, how bread was made, and how apprentices were trained. In London, Paris, and Florence, the bakers' guilds had their own rules, their own judges, even their own ceremonies. To join, you had to spend years as an apprentice, sleeping above the bakery, covered in flour dust, learning the balance between fire, flour, and air. One small mistake could ruin your reputation. Too much water and the dough collapsed. Too much fire and the crust burned. Too little salt, and your bread was bland and suspiciously tasteless. But the most dangerous of all was the underweight loaf. If your bread was found light, it was considered fraud. And medieval fraud was not a light matter. A baker could be fined, banned, or even publicly humiliated. Records from the 13th century show that some bakers in England were paraded through the streets with their bad bread tied around their necks. The townspeople laughed, and the baker, red-faced and ashamed, would swear never to repeat the mistake. Yet behind all this regulation was something surprisingly modern, a sense of consumer protection. The medieval market system was fragile, and famine was always near. If bakers cheated even a little, people starved. So every crumb mattered. Still, for the bakers themselves, life was exhausting. Ovens had to be fired before dawn, sometimes burning for hours before reaching the right heat. Wood was expensive, flour easily spoiled, and yeast had to be coaxed from the air itself. No little packets on a grocery shelf, no instant mix. Just patience, warmth, and hope. Picture a small town in the year 1325. The streets are dark and muddy. The smell of smoke hangs in the air. Inside a low-stone bakery, a man named Thomas turns his loaves on a wooden peel. His wife shapes the next batch. Their daughter brushes the tops with a rag dipped in water. The whole family works in silence, the rhythm of centuries. The bell in the square will soon ring 6 times. The bread must be ready before sunrise when the first customers arrive. But Thomas worries. The grain this month came from a new merchant. The flour is coarse and uneven, and the dough feels strange under his hands. He presses it again, listening. Bakers could tell by sound whether the dough was right. It gives a faint sigh, too wet. He adds a little more flour, but the fire in the oven burns hotter than usual. By morning, the loaves are brown crisp, and slightly lighter than the law allows. He knows it the moment he touches them. A few ounces short, he hesitates. He could try to sell them anyway. The townsfolk might not notice. Or he could take the loss, feed the bread to his pigs, and start again tonight. But that means no profit, and he has children to feed. He sighs. As the first knock comes at the door, Thomas glances toward the small scale by the counter, the same one the inspector will use later that day. For most people, bread was comfort. For Thomas, it was risk. One batch too light and he could lose everything, and yet every night he baked again, because the town depended on him. Because without bakers like Thomas, the morning would come without breakfast, and that in the Middle Ages was unthinkable. The bread had to be made no matter the fear, no matter the rules, and perhaps that's what made the medieval baker's life both noble and tragic. They stood at the crossroads of hunger and law, bound by a duty so simple and yet so absolute: don't let the bread go wrong. But of course, it often did, and when it did, strange things happened. Laws were rewritten, punishments invented, and superstitions spread like flour in the air. Because in a world where food was sacred, a ruined loaf could feel like a curse. So what did medieval bakers actually do when the bread went wrong? Did they hide it? Sell it in secret? Blame the flour, the weather, or the will of God? You settle in a little deeper. The sounds of the medieval marketplace beginning to fade in your imagination. Soft chatter, wooden carts rolling on cobblestones, the creak of a bread oven's iron door. By now dawn has broken. The baker's work is done, but his worries are only beginning, because once the loaves leave the oven, they belong not to him, but to the law of the loaf. In medieval towns, bread wasn't a private business. It was a public duty. The officials called it the assize of bread and ale, a set of laws so precise that it listed ounce by ounce how much a loaf should weigh depending on that week's price of wheat. If the cost of wheat rose, loaves got smaller. If it fell, loaves grew bigger. The idea was simple: keep the people fed and keep the peace. But enforcing it was anything but simple. Inspectors, sometimes called bread weighers or viewers of the assize, would wander from bakery to bakery with little brass scales. They'd pick up a random loaf, test its weight, and record the result in a ledger bound with rough leather. If a baker's bread was too light, a fine was recorded. Too many fines, and the punishment grew harsher. Some towns took this very seriously. In 13th century England, bakers found guilty of selling underweight bread were punished with a form of public humiliation called the tumbrel, a wooden cart used for punishment parades. The baker would be tied to it and rolled slowly through the market square, sometimes with his bad bread tied around his neck. Children laughed, people jeered, and other bakers watched nervously, clutching their own loaves a little tighter. It was more than just embarrassment. It was a warning, because in a society built on scarcity, cheating with food was almost a sin. But the punishments didn't stop there. In London, records from the city rolls mention bakers being placed in the pillory. their heads and hands locked into wooden boards, while their burnt or light loaves were destroyed before them. One chronicler wrote, almost with dry amusement, that the smell of burning bread in the square was a scent of justice. Yet behind the drama, something fascinating was happening. Medieval cities were creating their first systems of quality control. The idea that a loaf should be the same day after day was new. Before guilds, bread was personal. Everyone baked differently. But as cities grew, the need for consistency became vital. A traveler from one town expected bread to weigh about the same as it did back home. That expectation, dull as it sounds, was the foundation of modern trade. To enforce this, bakers developed their own strange rituals, what we might call tests of honesty. Some guilds required bakers to bake an extra loaf in every batch, one more than they charged for. It was called the baker's dozen, 13 loaves for the price of 12. That way, if one loaf was found underweight, the customer still got their fair share overall. It was part of a baker's reputation, a small, boring act of fairness that echoed through centuries, but mistakes still happened. Sometimes the flour was poor or the yeast failed to rise. Sometimes a loaf was burnt at the edge or the oven floor got too hot. And sometimes the bread just went wrong. When that happened, medieval bakers had choices, none of them good. Some tried to hide the bad loaves in the back of the shop, selling them quietly to the desperate or the poor. Others offered them to monasteries, hoping charity would soften the blow of a failed batch. And some simply fed them to animals, writing off the loss as a lesson from the saints. But there was also fear, superstition mixed with science. Many bakers believed that bread could turn if it was disrespected. If you cursed near the dough, or let a black cat cross the bakery floor, or forgot to trace a cross over the loaf before baking, disaster might follow. Not just a bad batch, but a curse on your entire trade. So even as laws grew stricter, old habits remained. Every baker's oven was both a workshop and a chapel, and the guild inspectors were almost like priests of dough and fire. Their tests were meticulous. Some dipped loaves in water to see if they sank. Too much air meant deceit. Some cut loaves open in front of the baker, measuring texture, moisture, and crust. If a loaf looked suspiciously light, it could be broken apart in public to reveal whether it had been hollowed or filled with cheaper grain. Imagine standing there, your livelihood being dissected in front of your neighbors, the smell of warm bread mixing with the chill of humiliation. Even so, many bakers respected the inspectors. The rules, as harsh as they were, gave them protection too. They kept grain merchants honest, set fair prices for flour, and stopped the powerful from hoarding food during famine. A baker could point to the law and say, "I am only following the assize." It was both a burden and a shield. Over time, guilds became highly organized. Apprentices worked 7 years before earning the right to open their own bakery. Journeymen traveled between towns to learn new techniques. How to control oven heat, how to blend rye with wheat, how to judge fermentation by smell alone. These weren't mystical arts, they were survival skills. The kind that didn't make history books but quietly kept whole populations alive. In some places, even the church got involved. Monastic bakeries produced bread for hospitals, pilgrims, and the poor. Their loaves were often marked with symbols, crosses, saints' initials, or sacred seals, to show they'd been blessed and inspected. For the hungry traveler, that mark was a promise: this bread won't cheat you. Still, not all bakers were saints. Historical court rolls mention several false bakers who used tricks to increase profit, adding ground beans or chalk to flour, wetting dough to make it heavier before baking, or baking loaves unevenly so they'd appear larger than they were. Each discovery led to a trial, and each trial to a new rule in the ever-growing book of bread law. And yet, Beneath the regulations and punishments, you can almost feel something deeply human: fear, pride, and the fragile balance of trust between one person and their community. Bread was more than food. It was the measure of fairness. A man's loaf was his word, so when the bread went wrong, the whole system trembled. Because in the Middle Ages, a bad loaf wasn't just an accident. It was a small betrayal of trust, of law, and of the fragile rhythm that kept the market square from turning to chaos. Still, humanity found its way through. The baker's dozen became a sign of honesty. Guild apprentices learned to respect the delicate balance of weight and warmth. And those who dared to cheat, well, they baked their own shame. By the end of the 14th century, the punishments grew less public and the laws became more practical. Markets evolved, trade expanded, and bread, once the center of fear and faith, became at last just bread. Still important, still sacred, but not terrifying, and yet something remains haunting about that time, when a man could be paraded for a crust too light, when bread was law and the oven was both a friend and a judge. It makes you wonder, how did these strange rigid rules, and born in dusty medieval towns, shape the way we eat and trust food today? Why do we still expect a loaf to weigh exactly what the label says? Why does something as ordinary as bread still carry the weight of honesty? Maybe because history has taught us that once, a loaf of bread could decide your fate. The winter of 1351 was cold enough to freeze the flour mills. The rivers turned to glass and the grinding stones stood still. In London, the Bakers' Guild met in a cramped hall lit by tallow candles and the faint glow of a dying fire. They had a problem. Wheat was scarce and the price of grain had doubled. But the assize of bread and ale still demanded that loaves be sold at the same fixed rate. If they followed the law, they'd lose money on every loaf. If they raised the price, they'd face fines or worse. So the bakers did what desperate craftsmen always did. They negotiated with the law itself. It was one of the first moments in English history where a working trade group petitioned for economic reform. And all because of bread. They wrote to the city council, pleading that the cost of wheat had made baking impossible. They promised honesty, fairness, and clean weight, but begged for flexibility. The officials, perhaps remembering their own empty tables, finally agreed. From then on, the weight of a loaf would rise and fall with the market, updated weekly. A small change, but a quiet revolution. The first living, adjustable pricing system in medieval Europe. It sounds dull, a list of numbers, a table of grain prices. But it was one of those tiny bureaucratic miracles that made modern trade possible. Behind it, there were tired men like Thomas the baker, their hands cracked from heat and cold, just hoping to survive another week without breaking a rule they couldn't afford to follow. The bread inspectors still made their rounds, but the punishments softened. Instead of pillories and carts, bakers paid small fines or lost a day's trade. The market became calmer, the rules more flexible, and the guilds, those quiet keepers of order, grew stronger. For the first time, being a baker was not just dangerous work. It was respected. A skilled baker could feed a city. He could earn trust, wealth, even influence. Some guild masters became aldermen, advisors to local councils. Their ovens, once symbols of fear, became engines of prosperity. But change came slowly, like dough rising in the cold. In France, a similar transformation unfolded. The boulangeries of Paris, once bound by the same rigid laws, began to innovate. They experimented with fermentation, with oven design, with new grains. One chronicler from the 1400s described how French bakers were learning to make lighter, airier loaves, an early ancestor of the modern baguette. And as bread evolved, so did the laws that governed it. By the Renaissance, bread had become both art and science. The guilds turned into schools, training bakers not just in rules but in craft, in the rhythm of fermentation, the perfect timing of a crust. Apprentices learned to listen for the sigh of the oven, to judge color by candlelight, to weigh a loaf by feel alone. It was no longer just about obeying the law. It was about mastering it, and in that mastery lay a strange sort of freedom. Because once the rules became part of their hands and their habits, the bakers didn't need to fear them anymore. They were the law, in flour and in fire. Even as the centuries turned, echoes of those old punishments remained. The phrase "the baker's dozen," born from guilt and caution, became a symbol of generosity. When a modern baker adds a free roll or a little extra crust, they're repeating an act of honesty first forged under threat of the pillory. The tradition outlived the fear, and those meticulous weighing tables, the ones copied and recopied by medieval scribes, became the foundation of food regulation itself. Every barcode, every label on a loaf today, listing weight, ingredients, and price, traces its ancestry back to those weary guild clerks scratching numbers into parchment by candlelight. Their world was small, but their idea, fairness through measure, grew vast. It's strange to think about, that the rhythm of modern supermarkets, the quiet confidence we have in a loaf's price and weight, began in those dim medieval bakeries, the same places where bread could betray a man or save him. And yet something else happened too, something less visible. When bread became regulated, it also became trusted. People no longer feared being cheated. That trust made it possible for trade to expand, for towns to grow, for cities to thrive, all because the people believed that a loaf was honest. The baker's story, humble, dusty, repetitive, is one of civilization's silent triumphs. They took chaos, the unpredictability of grain, of weather, of hunger, and turned it into order. Through rules, through routine, through a little bit of boring paperwork and a lot of sleepless nights, they built the foundation of economic fairness. When we say breaking bread today, we mean sharing peace. But for the medieval baker, breaking bread was a test, a daily trial of skill, honesty, and survival. They broke it to prove their worth. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear that world again. The scrape of wooden paddles, the hiss of steam, the muffled heartbeat of the oven in the early morning dark. You can see the flour settling in beams of light, the baker wiping his hands on his apron, listening to the crackle of cooling crusts. Each loaf a promise that he'd done his duty, that he'd earned another day's trust. He couldn't have known that his boring, weary trade would shape the future, that centuries later, people would still live by the quiet rules his guild once wrote. He only knew that the bread had to be right. And maybe in a way that's enough, because sometimes the most ordinary things, the things no one notices, the small routines of daily life, are what truly hold a civilization together. A measured loaf, a fair price, a promise kept even when no one's watching. And so when we slice into a loaf today, perfectly baked, evenly weighted, its crust just right, we're touching the legacy of those old bakers, of Thomas and his nervous hands, of guildmasters and market inspectors, of flour, fire, and fear turned slowly into fairness. History doesn't always march with kings and battles. Sometimes it rises quietly in the dark, one loaf at a time. For most of history, wars were fought for gold, for land, for power. But there was another treasure, pale, quiet, and hidden in plain sight, that ruled over them all. Salt. It sparkled not in jewelry boxes, but in barrels and sacks. It didn't decorate crowns. It preserved meat. It was the difference between hunger and survival, between decay and life. And for centuries, the story of salt was also the story of control. It's hard to imagine today when salt sits on every kitchen table, cheap and endless. But once it was a currency. People were paid in salt. The Roman salarium, from which we get the word salary, literally meant salt money. A soldier's loyalty could be measured by how much salt he earned. In the medieval world, Salt was precious not for its flavor but for its magic. Without it, meat spoiled, fish rotted, and armies starved. Cities near salt mines thrived. Those without it begged or paid dearly. It was, in a way, the world's first energy source, invisible, vital, and easy to tax. And so governments did. Everywhere from China to France, rulers realized something profound. You could tax salt and no one could avoid it. Rich or poor, king or peasant, everyone needed it. The result was one of the longest and most persistent taxes in human history. A tax that built fortunes, caused rebellions, and quietly shaped nations for centuries. In France, it was called the gabelle, a word that began softly but ended in centuries of quiet anger. It started small, as a simple fee to regulate trade. But as kings grew greedy, the tax deepened, spreading through every province like a fine dust. By the 14th century, the gabelle had become infamous. Different regions paid different rates. The lucky ones paid almost nothing, while others were crushed under endless levies. People began smuggling salt the way others smuggled gold. Salt runners, known as fauconniers, moved at night through forests and marshes carrying sacks of contraband over their shoulders. They risked imprisonment, even death, just to bring a pinch of salt to their neighbors. And still, the government insisted it was for the good of the realm. Officially, the gabelle funded roads, armies, and royal projects. Unofficially, it funded palaces. It kept the king's table rich while the common man's bread tasted of tears and brine. But what makes the salt tax fascinating, and somehow beautiful in its boredom, is how quietly it endured. For more than 400 years it persisted through plagues, wars, and revolutions. Kings fell, empires rose, yet the tax on salt remained. Because no matter who ruled, someone always needed the money, and everyone always needed salt. There was something haunting about that balance. Every grain of salt weighed against every grain of trust between people and power. A delicate equilibrium, maintained by scribes and soldiers who probably never tasted the luxury their labor paid for. In India, the story was different, but eerily familiar. British colonial rulers, recognizing the same truth, imposed their own salt tax in the 1800s. It was a small fee on paper, but devastating in practice. It turned the basic act of survival into a crime. People who boiled seawater to make their own salt were fined or beaten. It wasn't rebellion that frightened the empire. It was self-sufficiency. Centuries later, one man, a quiet lawyer with wire-rimmed glasses and a walking stick, decided to challenge that. Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March of 1930 began with a simple act: picking up salt from the seashore. That handful of crystals became a symbol of resistance stronger than any army. Empires had taxed salt for millennia. Gandhi turned it into freedom's banner. It's strange how history loops like that. From Roman soldiers paid in salt, to Indian peasants punished for it. From kings building palaces to protesters building nations, all tied to something so ordinary that it dissolves between your fingers. But before salt became rebellion, it was routine. Bureaucracy, ledgers, and long days in dusty offices. In medieval France, salt officials sat at long tables covered in parchment, recording every shipment that passed through their ports. A shipmaster arriving with a cargo of white crystals had to stop at the salt barn, declare his load, and pay the king's share before selling a grain. It was slow, repetitive, and endlessly dull, but it kept the realm running, and if you stood there long enough watching the scales tip, you might notice something almost hypnotic. The rhythm of commerce, the slow clinking of coins, the faint hiss of salt poured from one sack to another. A sound that built empires, because salt wasn't just taxed and it was trusted. A sack of salt was predictable, measurable, dependable. It didn't rot or rust. It stored value across seasons, across wars. In a world of uncertainty, salt was stability. That stability gave birth to bureaucracy, the real backbone of civilization. Scribes, merchants, inspectors, taxmen. People who never held a sword but quietly held society together, the boring heroes of history. And through them, the salt tax became a kind of ritual, as steady as tides, as dull as sand, as eternal as law. For those who paid it, though, it was a slow burn of injustice. And in time, that slow burn would ignite revolutions. But before that, the salt tax would do something else, something far more subtle. It would knit entire countries together through paperwork, trade routes, and shared dependency. Salt didn't just flavor food, it flavored civilization itself. And so, from the dry salt pans of Provence to the sea marshes of Bengal, from the caravans of Timbuktu to the granaries of Venice, salt flowed like blood through the veins of history. Quietly, constantly unseen. It made kings rich, peasants poor, and governments powerful. And for all its simplicity, it may be the most influential substance ever mined from the earth. But even the most patient people, after centuries of paying for what the sea gives freely, begin to ask questions. Why does the king own the salt? Who owns the ocean? And what happens when ordinary people, tired of silence, then decide to take their salt back? That question, too, would rise, like a tide that no empire could stop. The story of salt was never just about taste or trade. It was about control. And where there is control, there is defiance. When kings and ministers began taxing salt, they thought they had found the perfect system. No one could live without it. So surely no one could escape paying for it. But humans, even in the most obedient centuries, have a quiet talent for bending rules. And so began the secret roads of salt. By the 15th century in France, salt had become more precious than gold in some regions, not because it was rare, but because it was restricted. Every citizen was required by law to buy a set amount of salt each year from royal warehouses. You couldn't choose your supplier, or skip your purchase even if you already had enough. The government called it fair distribution. The people called it theft, and that's how the fauxonniers were born. The salt smugglers. They were millers, fishermen, farmers, and sometimes even priests. Ordinary people who turned to night work under the pale light of the moon. They traveled through forests, rivers, and forgotten footpaths, carrying heavy sacks strapped to their backs or hidden beneath hay carts. Theirs was not a life of glory, just one of quiet defiance. The penalties were severe. If caught, a smuggler could be imprisoned, branded, or even executed. But still they came, because what they carried was not just salt. It was the taste of freedom, the right to season their own food without the king's permission. In the dim silence of rural nights, whole families took part in the trade. Mothers stitched secret pockets inside cloaks. Children acted as lookouts along the road. Sometimes local officials turned a blind eye, especially when their own tables needed salt. But others, like the royal inspectors, treated the job as sacred duty. They were the guardians of the gabelle, the salt tax, and their authority stretched farther than the king's sword. Armed with ledgers and wax seals, they patrolled villages, searching for unmarked salt or suspicious merchants. They could enter homes without warning, overturning barrels and cupboards in search of the forbidden grain. The villagers hated them. In taverns, they were called the salt wolves, and perhaps that name was fair, for the wolves came at night, sniffing for the scent of disobedience. In time, the salt tax created not only smugglers but entire underground economies. Along the western coast of France, near Brittany, communities learned to harvest sea salt in secret. By day they were fishermen and farmers. By night they became alchemists of the shore, scraping crystals from the tidal flats, drying them in silence and trading them inland through a web of coded signals. One of those routes came to be known as La Route du Sel, the Salt Road. It wound through hidden forests and sleepy villages, marked not by signs but by memory. Each bend, each stream, each lonely barn had a meaning to those who walked it. If a candle burned in the window, it meant safe passage. If not, danger waited nearby. What makes these salt smugglers remarkable is not their rebellion, but their persistence. For over 400 years, generation after generation kept the trade alive. The state outlawed it, punished it, and yet it endured quietly, patiently. A soft, constant protest that no decree could fully erase. And while smugglers worked by moonlight, the bureaucrats worked by candlelight. Inside the royal offices of Paris, clerks filled books with numbers so endless that even the accountants fell asleep counting. Every bag, every coin, every measure of salt had to be recorded. And so the gabelle became not just a tax, it became an empire of paper. Thousands of clerks, inspectors, and guards made their living from it. The salt flowed, the money flowed, and the system grew heavier and slower with each passing year. It's strange, really, how empires decay not with battles, but with boredom. Paper upon paper, signature upon signature, until the weight of administration itself begins to crack the world beneath it. In the 1700s, France was already trembling from within. Farmers starved, bread prices rose, and still the king's officials demanded payment for salt. When the revolution finally came, it was not just for liberty and equality, it was for relief. And one of the first decrees of the new government was to abolish the gabelle. But salt's story didn't end there. In India, the British had studied the French example carefully. When they imposed their own salt tax, they did it with modern precision. Barbed wire guards and coastal patrols. The law said no one could make salt from seawater without permission. The punishment was imprisonment. To the empire, it seemed reasonable. To the people, it was absurd, because in the coastal villages of Gujarat and Bengal, salt was life. Fishermen boiled it daily, not for profit but for survival, and yet every pot of boiling brine became an act of rebellion. It was here, centuries after the French smugglers faded into history, that Gandhi began his march. From his ashram in Sabarmati, he walked more than 200 miles to the Arabian Sea. Behind him, thousands followed. When he finally bent down and picked up a small lump of salt, it wasn't about flavor, it was about freedom. In that quiet act, the old story repeated itself. A government taxed survival, and the people answered not with violence but with persistence. Salt once again had turned from a seasoning into a symbol. From the smugglers of Brittany to the marchers of India, it carried the same quiet message. There are limits to what power can own, and perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about this so-called boring history. For centuries, salt connected the smallest acts, seasoning a meal, boiling water, carrying a bag, to the largest ideas, freedom, justice, and dignity. The smugglers may have never known it, but with every hidden sack they carried through the night, they were also carrying the weight of history, one grain at a time. There comes a moment in every empire's life when the paper grows heavier than the sword. For France, that moment arrived quietly, carried not by thunder or war, but by whispers of exhaustion. After centuries of enforcement, the gabelle, that quiet, cruel salt tax, had drained not just wallets but patience. Villagers were tired of hiding salt beneath floorboards. Merchants were tired of paying 3 times over for the same grain. And the clerks, perhaps most of all, were tired of writing. By the time the French Revolution began in 1789, the salt tax had become a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime. Unfair, outdated, absurdly complicated. When the National Assembly met to write the new laws of France, one of the earliest votes, taken almost in a sigh, was to abolish it. The motion passed not with cheers, but with relief. It was as though an invisible weight had lifted off the country's shoulders. For the first time in over 400 years, salt belonged to the people again. It was a strange moment, almost anticlimactic. There were no grand ceremonies, no parades, just silence. And then, perhaps, a faint clatter of lids being lifted off old jars, of salt poured freely, without fear. But even in freedom, habits linger. For decades afterward, people still whispered when buying salt, still glanced over their shoulders. The memory of punishment doesn't fade easily. It lingers in muscle and in mind, like the taste of brine on the tongue. And yet, the absence of the tax did something remarkable. It changed the rhythm of life. Farmers could preserve more food for winter. Fishermen salted their catches more freely, selling them farther and cheaper. Bakers experimented with new kinds of bread, unafraid of wasting precious grains. The country grew not only richer but more flavorful. It's a quiet kind of progress, the kind you don't see in monuments or wars, but in the calm hum of daily life. In a mother's kitchen, in a merchant's ledger, in the steady, rhythmic sound of a mill wheel turning again. That's the hidden beauty of boring history, the small freedoms that reshape everything else. And while France moved on, other nations still held onto their own salt taxes. In India, it would take nearly 2 more centuries for that grain of rebellion to dissolve. Even after Gandhi's march, the British clung to their regulations, fearing that to give up control of salt was to give up control altogether. But the tide had turned. The world was changing, and the salt was slipping through their fingers. By 1947, as India gained independence, one of the first symbolic acts of the new government was to end the colonial salt laws. Once again, a basic element of life was returned to the people. And that's the quiet miracle of this story. It's not about kings or revolutions, not even about taxes or trade. It's about how something as small as salt, invisible, dissolving, ordinary, carried within it the power to break empires. Think of it this way. Gold has shimmered and vanished. Kingdoms have risen and crumbled. But salt, humble and constant, remains on every table in every kitchen, across every culture. It's the quiet link between us and every civilization before us. Every time you sprinkle a little salt on your food, you're echoing thousands of years of struggle, from Roman soldiers earning their salarium, to French smugglers trudging through the mud, to Gandhi's marchers walking barefoot to the sea. Each grain is a memory of defiance, of necessity, of patience. A reminder that history's most powerful changes often begin with something so small, so ordinary that no one notices, until it's too late to stop. Salt freed itself, not through war, but through weariness. Through centuries of people quietly asking the same question. Why should anyone own what the earth gives freely? And maybe that's the true end of the... Tonight's journey drifts further into the dim corners of medieval life, where the night was not just dark but alive. Before lamps, before switches, before cities glowed through the hours, there was only the small trembling light of a candle. To live by that light was to live carefully. Every flame was precious, every hour after sunset costly. In a world ruled by daylight, darkness was not simply the absence of sun. It was a boundary. It told you when to stop working, when to sleep, when to pray, and for most of history only the rich could afford to ignore it. The story of light in the Middle Ages begins not with invention, but with labor, with the quiet, patient craft of the chandlers, the candle makers. Their workshops smelled of wax and smoke, and their days were spent between buckets and string, between tallow and hope. Tallow and the thick, greasy fat of sheep and cattle was the lifeblood of common light. It was cheap, abundant, and foul-smelling. When burned, it gave off a dull yellow flame and a scent that clung to everything. A tallow candle might last only a few hours, leaving behind trails of soot and dripping wax that hardened on cold stone floors. But for the poor, it was light enough. For the wealthy, however, the candle was not just utility, it was status. They used beeswax, golden and fragrant. Beeswax burned cleanly with little smoke and filled rooms with a faint sweetness that mingled with incense and spice. A single beeswax candle could cost a day's wage for a laborer. A grand cathedral might use thousands every month. Imagine it, the great churches of Europe glowing not from divine miracle but from human industry. Each flickering flame a symbol of devotion, paid for by someone's toil. The light of prayer powered by trade. In some towns, candle making became one of the most regulated crafts of the age. Guilds protected recipes and rituals like sacred secrets. To make a proper candle was both chemistry and patience. The process began with string, flax or hemp, dipped again and again into molten tallow or wax. Each dip added a thin coat, slowly building up a sturdy column. Dozens of wicks hung from long wooden rods like pale fruit drying in a warm kitchen. The air shimmered with heat. The floor was slick with wax. By evening, the chandler's hands were scarred and shiny from hours of work, and yet they were proud. Their candles lit the halls of kings, the altars of cathedrals, the humble tables of families saying evening prayers. They provided what everyone needed but few noticed, the small comfort of not being alone in the dark. In cities like Paris and London, the candle trade flourished. Every parish had its preferred chandler, and guild rules ensured strict quality and pricing. Even the church demanded its share. Tithes were sometimes paid in candles rather than coin. Light, after all, was considered a form of offering. But while the guilds prospered, the countryside dimmed. Peasants made their own rough candles or relied on rushlights. Long reeds dipped in animal fat. A rushlight burned unevenly, sputtering, hissing, and dying within minutes. Families gathered close around them, talking softly while shadows moved along the walls. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And there's something quietly beautiful in that. How humanity has always reached for light, no matter how small. In the medieval night, light wasn't just visibility. It was safety. It kept away thieves, animals, and fears that seemed larger after sunset. Children were told stories by candlelight. Stories of saints and sinners, of wolves in forests and angels in dreams. When the flame went out, the story ended. And so did the day. For centuries, the rhythm of life followed that flicker. A single candle could decide whether work continued or ceased. Merchants balanced accounts by candlelight. Monks copied manuscripts deep into the night. Lovers whispered in the glow of a single flame. And still, few people thought of the hands that made those candles. The people who melted, poured, cooled, and trimmed, day after day, year after year. The chandler's world was one of quiet repetition, a cycle of melting and molding, of lighting and relighting. Perhaps that's why their trade feels almost meditative when we think about it now. It was slow, rhythmic, humble, the kind of work that shaped civilization without ever claiming fame. But behind the soft light of every candle was a harder truth. Not all light was pure. Some candles, especially the tallow kind, carried disease. The fat could spoil or mold, spreading foul odors through homes and markets. Rats and insects gathered near storage barrels. For some, the smell of light itself was a burden. And yet the demand never dimmed, because even the worst candle was better than none. The Middle Ages were an age of shadows, of faith, superstition, and survival. But through it all, people kept lighting candles one after another as if refusing to surrender to the dark. And maybe that's what makes this quiet history so human. It wasn't about progress or profit, but persistence. A reminder that even the smallest flame can hold back an endless night. Still, light came at a cost, and in the centuries to come, that cost would grow higher. Candle making would evolve from a household craft to an industry of privilege, and soon light itself would become something to tax, to regulate, and to trade like gold. But before that, the chandlers had one more golden age, a time when the flicker of their craft shone in every window and church across Europe. And that moment, that glow before the dawn of electricity, was both their triumph and their quiet farewell. If you could walk through a medieval city at dusk, you would know the hour by the glow. In the narrow streets, windows flickered unevenly, a soft, trembling light that danced along walls of stone and wood. But not all candles were equal. In the poorest homes, light sputtered, smoky and faint. In the manors of merchants and bishops, it was steady and bright, as though the night itself obeyed their wealth. The difference wasn't just in what burned, tallow or beeswax, but in who was allowed to make it. Candle making was not a free trade. It belonged to the Guild of Chandlers, a brotherhood of craftsmen who guarded their methods like secrets of alchemy. To become a chandler, you needed years of apprenticeship and the blessing of the guild's elders. They taught you how to melt, pour, twist, and cool. They taught you how to keep the wax pure, the wicks even, the shape perfect. And most of all, they taught you how to keep the mystery alive. For light in the Middle Ages was more than utility. It was authority. Every church and monastery depended on candles to mark the sacred hours. Every noble house needed them for feasts, ceremonies, and guests. Even the city's justice depended on light. Court sessions were often limited by how long a candle could burn. A judge's patience, it was said, lasted as long as his wax. Because candles were so essential, the guilds gained quiet power. They controlled prices, supply, and even the timing of sales. In some cities, only guild members could legally sell candles after sunset, a rule that made every flame a kind of license. But the guilds also served a higher purpose. They standardized quality. A candle that burned too quickly or too dimly could be dangerous. In wooden houses packed tightly together, one bad candle could mean a fire that destroyed an entire neighborhood. And so every chandler's mark carried a kind of trust. Still, the rules weren't always fair. Women, who often made candles in their homes, were forbidden from joining the guild. Their work was considered domestic, not professional, even though their candles lit most of the city. They sold them quietly in markets or traded them for bread and fabric, their small profits overlooked by the law. Some historians say that women's candle making was one of the earliest informal economies, invisible, unpaid, but essential. A light beneath the light, keeping homes alive while guilds took the credit. And so light became layered, social, economic, spiritual. A flicker of flame could reveal class and privilege as clearly as a crest or coat of arms. Walk into a medieval church and you'd see it immediately. The wealthy paid for beeswax candles to be burned at the altar, symbols of purity, devotion, and status. The poor offered smaller tallow candles, smoky and short-lived, their prayers flickering out before the hour was done. Even faith, it seemed, had a price per ounce. The church itself was one of the largest consumers of light in Europe. Monasteries ordered candles by the thousands. Some even owned beehives specifically for wax production, tended by monks who spent their days humming softly among the hives. They believed bees were sacred creatures, pure, industrious, and untouched by sin. To them, beeswax was the holiest substance on earth, created not by corruption or decay, but by divine labor. In cathedrals, candles turned faith into spectacle. Imagine the great nave of Chartres or Canterbury, hundreds of flames shimmering across stained glass, turning stone into gold. Light became a language, soft for mourning, bright for celebration, eternal for God. And in the shadows of that holy glow, the chandlers thrived. They became indispensable, their craft woven into the fabric of religion and rule. Some rose to wealth, forming powerful families that supplied both altar and palace. Others remained humble, working long hours over vats of melting wax, dreaming of a day when their light might burn in a cathedral. But light, as always, attracts shadow. The more valuable candles became, the more temptation followed. Some chandlers began mixing cheaper fats into beeswax to increase profits. The deception was difficult to detect until the candles were lit. A single smoky flame could expose a fraud. Guild inspectors roamed the markets, cutting samples, melting them in test pots, and sniffing for impurity. It was a strangely poetic kind of justice. The truth revealed only by fire, and yet, despite the strict rules, black market candle making persisted. Tallow was easy to find, and night was always hungry. The poor continued to make their own candles, rough and uneven but free. Every home, every cottage became a small act of independence, a tiny rebellion against the monopoly of light. By the late Middle Ages, the candle trade had become one of the quiet engines of urban life. Taxes were collected from guild sales, processions were lit by purchased wax, and even funerals required candles by law. Light, once a blessing, had become a ledger entry. It's strange how something so gentle, a flame, a flicker, a scent of honey and smoke, could sustain an entire economy. But perhaps that's what makes it such a powerful symbol. The light that guides prayer is the same light that fills the treasury. The same candle that blesses a king's coronation might light the table of a peasant the next day. Its wax remolded and reused. In that cycle of melting and rebirth, of giving and taking, there's something deeply human. A small, steady reminder that even luxury begins in labor, and that behind every glow there are hands you never see. Still, as the centuries passed, something began to change. A new light was coming, one that burned brighter, cheaper, and faster than wax ever could. The chandlers didn't know it yet, but their craft was living its final golden age. Soon the world would discover oil and gas, and then electricity. And the old guilds, with all their rituals and rules, would fade into memory. But before their flame went out, they would leave behind one lasting legacy, a culture that saw light not as convenience but as meaning. To them, light was life, and even in its decline, that idea would never die. There was a time, not very long ago, when night was absolute, when darkness wasn't something to fear, but something to share. In the centuries before electricity, the world after sunset belonged to another rhythm entirely. Candles, no matter how fine, were too costly to waste. And so, when the day ended, most people simply stopped. Shops closed early, voices lowered. The city dimmed until only a few scattered windows glowed faintly, like embers in a sea of black. Night had its own order, quieter, slower, almost sacred. Most homes kept just one candle burning. It wasn't meant to illuminate, it was meant to comfort. A flame small enough to keep the shadows company, not chase them away. The wealthy might linger a little longer, reading, writing, or praying beneath tall beeswax candles. But even kings and bishops eventually surrendered to the dark. The night did not negotiate. Sleep itself was different then. People didn't sleep once, but twice. Historians call it segmented sleep, a forgotten rhythm of human rest. At dusk, families went to bed soon after supper, wrapped in wool and silence. They slept a few hours until around midnight, the first sleep. Then they woke gently, not to alarms or duties, but to thought. This middle period of wakefulness, sometimes an hour, sometimes two, was known as the watch. It was a time for small quiet acts. Some prayed, some read by candlelight, whispering psalms or stories. Others simply talked, soft conversations shared in the dark, half dream, half memory. In the villages, couples often used this time to tend to embers, check on animals, or simply sit by the dying light. Letters from the 16th century describe it as the peace between sleeps, a phrase both poetic and practical. When the second sleep came, it was deep, unbroken, and sweet. It's strange to think how normal that once was. Night wasn't an enemy to conquer. It was a landscape to wander through. Darkness was the canvas on which dreams were painted, and then slowly everything changed. When oil lamps and streetlights arrived, people began staying awake later. The old rhythm broke. First sleep and second sleep merged into one long stretch, and the quiet watch, that tender pause in the middle of the night, disappeared. The Chandlers watched this change with unease. Their craft had given the world its first human light, but now it was being replaced by fire without wax, light without flame. The very thing that had once made them powerful, the control of light, was slipping away. In the 18th century, whale oil lamps filled the streets of London and Amsterdam. Then came gaslight, brighter, harsher, unstoppable. By the 19th century, electric bulbs arrived, and with them, the end of night as humanity had always known it. It's easy to call that progress, and in many ways it was. Cities became safer, work hours expanded. The world began to move faster, think faster, live faster. But something quiet was lost too. Something made of silence and patience. For 1,000 years, darkness had been a teacher. It taught people how to wait, how to listen, how to rest between the moments of their own lives. Today, our nights are filled with artificial suns, glowing screens, endless light. We've forgotten how to see in the dark. And with that, perhaps, we've lost a piece of our older wisdom. The candle makers didn't vanish overnight. For centuries, they survived by making ceremonial and decorative candles, for churches, for weddings, for memory. Even now, when you light one, you're touching the same history. The hands of the monks, the guilds, the women at their kitchen tables, all shaping the same small flame. It's remarkable, isn't it? A single candle can connect you to 1,000 forgotten nights, to the rhythm of first sleep and second sleep, to a world where darkness was not defeat, but design. The candle's light was never meant to overpower the dark, only to remind us that even in it there's warmth. That has always been the quiet truth of human history. We survive not by banishing the dark, but by learning to live inside it. And so the Chandler's legacy endures, not in the markets or the guild halls, but in every flame that burns slowly, softly, in defiance of the endless glow. Their story reminds us of something simple and strange, that progress often begins with loss, and that sometimes the slowest light leaves the deepest mark. There are few sounds more soothing or more ominous than the slow, rhythmic scratching of a quill. Picture it. A dim stone chamber in a medieval castle, lit by a single wavering candle. Behind a narrow desk sits a man in brown wool, his face pale from too many hours indoors. Before him lies a mountain of parchment, each sheet crowded with cramped handwriting, names, numbers, debts, dues. This is not a priest nor a scholar nor a noble. This is a clerk, the quiet architect of empire. He will not swing a sword or build a cathedral. His only weapon is ink, and yet, Through that ink, kingdoms rise and fall. It's easy to forget that bureaucracy, that endlessly boring machinery of forms, stamps, and ledgers, began as a revolution. Not a fiery one, but a slow and paper-bound rebellion against chaos. In the early Middle Ages, rulers wanted to know what they owned. How much land? How many cows? How much grain could be taxed? But memory, rumor, and oral oaths were unreliable, so kings began to write things down. At first, these records were simple lists, crude tallies carved into wood or scratched onto wax tablets. But by the 9th and 10th centuries, a new breed of professional began to appear in royal courts and monasteries. Men trained not in war, but in writing. They were the clerks and the clerici. In a world where literacy was rare, they were magicians of ink, able to trap time and ownership inside a page. And their magic spread. Every tax owed, every tithe collected, every judgment passed. It all began to live forever in parchment. To be written was to be real. The greatest example of this early bureaucratic power was the Domesday Book of 1086. Commissioned by William the Conqueror, it was nothing less than a survey of an entire kingdom. Teams of scribes traveled across England counting farms, mills, pigs, and even beehives. Every acre, every ox, every tenant was recorded. When it was finished, the book was said to be so complete that not even one ox or cow escaped its pages. The people called it Domesday, the Day of Judgment, because once your name was in it, there was no escape. You were taxed, known, fixed. The scribes, with their patient hands, had built an invisible cage of ink around the entire country. It was terrifying but brilliant. For the first time, a ruler didn't have to trust his lords or his memory. He had data. The dull labor of writing had become a kind of quiet power, the power to measure, to count, to control. But what was it like to be one of those early bureaucrats? Most clerks lived between worlds, half scholars, half servants. They spent their days hunched over rough wooden tables, ink-stained fingers stiff from the cold. Their room smelled of parchment and smoke, a mixture both comforting and claustrophobic. They copied numbers until their eyes blurred. They checked their sums by candlelight, muttering softly to themselves. Many of them were monks trained in monasteries where silence was sacred and discipline absolute. For them, paperwork was prayer. Every neat column and tidy line was an offering to order, an act of devotion in a messy world. And in that devotion, they found peace. Letters from 12th century monasteries describe clerks who worked long into the night, transcribing the tiniest details. A field's yield, a merchant's debt, a widow's rent. It wasn't exciting. It was stability. Each entry, each number, made the fragile idea of civilization a little more solid. Without them, nothing held. Over time, bureaucracy began to shape not only economies but minds. People started to think in categories, columns, and records. The world became something you could list, measure, and archive. It was tedious, yes, but it was also the beginning of accountability. A miller could appeal his tax because it was written. A widow could prove her rights because her husband's name appeared in the records. In a strange way, boredom brought fairness, but bureaucracy also created distance. Kings stopped seeing their subjects as faces and began seeing them as figures. Names became entries. Lives became numbers. A farmer's life might be reduced to a single line in a ledger. 3 acres, 2 oxen, 1 daughter taxed. That transformation, from person to data, is one of the quietest, most powerful shifts in human history. And it began right here, in these dim rooms filled with scribes where the air tasted of ink and dust. The clerks didn't think of themselves as world changers. Most of them simply wanted a steady meal and a place to sleep. Yet their routines shaped nations. Their boring tasks, adding, copying, sealing, and built the foundations of governance, law, and trade. Every empire that followed, the Ottoman, the Mughal, the Ming, the British, depended on the same dull miracle: paperwork. You might say that civilization itself runs on boredom, the slow patience of people. The story of bureaucracy didn't end with monks and quills. It only grew, spreading outward, multiplying like ivy across the walls of empire. By the late Middle Ages, the idea of the written record had escaped the monastery and taken root in the palace. Kings and queens discovered what every ruler eventually learns, that power is fragile without paperwork. And so, across Europe, rooms once meant for prayer or rest were transformed into something new: quiet spaces filled with desks, shelves, and men in ink-stained robes. The first offices. They didn't look like offices today. No glass windows or ticking clocks, just wooden tables, sand for drying ink, and bundles of scrolls tied with string. But the feeling, that hum of routine, that constant shuffle of parchment, was the same. In these rooms, the machinery of the state began to hum. Letters arrived from distant towns sealed with wax and stamped with crests. Each message carried a request, a complaint, or a tax. The clerks would sort them into piles: urgent, pending, completed. Centuries before the invention of folders or inboxes, some handled correspondence for kings. Others recorded court rulings, land grants, or trade licenses. Every act of rule became an act of writing. And so, bureaucracy grew a body: hands that copied, eyes that checked, and minds that remembered what others forgot. You can almost imagine the sound: a steady rhythm of quills scratching across parchment, the quiet cough of dust, the creak of a chair. Outside, wars might rage and thrones might change, but inside, the paperwork continued. Empires lived and died by its patience. One of the earliest and most famous examples of an organized bureaucracy was the Exchequer of medieval England. Founded in the 12th century, it was named for the checkered cloth that covered its tables, a giant counting board, black and white like a chessboard. Here, royal officials tallied the kingdom's income and expenses, using tokens and pebbles to represent coins and taxes. It was part office, part game, except the stakes were very real. When an official missed a figure, it wasn't just an error. It could mean famine, rebellion, or royal anger. So they checked, rechecked, and checked again. Every number, every seal. Accuracy wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. The clerks of the Exchequer were among the first people in Europe to use what we'd now call auditing. They kept 2 copies of every record, cross-referenced by multiple scribes. The process was so slow it could take months to complete a single year's accounts. And yet, it worked. Through boredom and repetition, they made chaos predictable. The church, too, became a master of paperwork. In Rome, papal administrators cataloged indulgences, donations, and decrees. They developed systems of filing that scholars later recognized as early archives, the ancestors of libraries and databases. The Vatican, in many ways, was the first corporate headquarters, a place where faith met filing. Across the world, other civilizations were doing the same. The Ottoman Empire kept detailed tax registers, called Tahrir Defterleri. In Ming China, clerks recorded census rolls so vast they filled entire halls. In the Islamic caliphates, scribes developed elaborate systems of calligraphic record-keeping. each elegant flourish both beautiful and binding. Every empire, it seems, understood the same quiet truth. You cannot rule what you cannot count. But as bureaucracy expanded, it began to change the people who worked within it. The medieval clerk, once a solitary scholar, became a functionary, one of many in a growing hive. His work was no longer personal or spiritual, it was procedural. He sat at a desk for 10 hours a day, copying figures he didn't understand for masters he would never meet. His days blurred together in ink and dust. He became a small part of something vast, a living cog in an invisible machine. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that sameness. Within the office walls, life was predictable. There were rules, forms, and ledgers that gave order to a chaotic world. No matter how loud the world outside became, inside the paperwork there was calm. It was, in its own way, the beginning of modern routine, the slow rhythm that would one day define the 9-to-5 world. By the 15th century, as trade and exploration expanded, bureaucracy began to travel. Ships carried not only spices and silver, but paperwork. Merchants needed invoices, contracts, and customs forms. Explorers needed royal charters stamped and sealed before they sailed. The world was becoming global, and with it came a global need for administration. The boring power that began in monasteries now fueled the age of discovery. Every voyage, every colony, every trade route was shadowed by documents, cargo lists, tax receipts, royal decrees. Behind every act of adventure there was an accountant. In that sense, the true empire wasn't built on maps or muskets. It was built on ledgers. Paper became the skeleton of power, and so, slowly, the office became a symbol, not of faith or royalty, but of continuity. Kings died, empires fell, but the records remained. In dusty vaults beneath cathedrals and castles, the paperwork slept, a paper memory that could outlive every dynasty. Even now, historians study those same ledgers to reconstruct the past. Without them, the Middle Ages would be a blur of myth and legend. With them, we can trace the price of bread, the wages of a mason, the names of peasants who lived and died unseen, the clerks, the accountants, the tax collectors. They preserved not glory, but truth. The quiet, tedious truth of how people really lived, and yet beneath that stillness a new restlessness was stirring. As paperwork grew, so did frustration. The same systems that brought order also brought delay, confusion, and absurdity. A man could wait months for a single approval, or lose his inheritance to a misplaced seal. By the dawn of the modern age, the office had become both a sanctuary and a trap. It promised safety through rules, but buried humanity beneath them. The bureaucrats didn't know it yet, but they were building a future where their descendants would spend lifetimes in paperwork, not by candlelight but by fluorescent glow. It begins, as all quiet revolutions do, with routine, a desk, a chair, a hand signing a name for the 1000th time. By the dawn of the modern era, the 16th and 17th centuries, paperwork had become the bloodstream of civilization. Empires didn't just conquer land. They conquered information. Every treaty, every census, every border, every law, all of it flowed through ink. The medieval clerk had evolved into a new creature, the bureaucrat. Less monk, more machine. Still patient, still pale, still surrounded by parchment, but now serving the world's first paper empires. When the Spanish and Portuguese empires began their conquests overseas, they didn't bring armies alone. They brought paperwork, For every ship that left Seville or Lisbon, there were pages of documents listing crew members, cargo weights, taxes, and permissions. When explorers returned, they brought not only gold or spices, but records, accounts of their journeys written in triplicate, stamped and stored in vast archives. To govern the New World, the Old World built entire cities of scribes. In Madrid, the Casa de la Contratación, the House of Trade, was filled with clerks who tracked every shipment across the Atlantic. In Mexico City and Lima, colonial administrators copied and recopied reports until their hands blistered. Each conquest, each colony, existed first as an entry in a ledger. It wasn't the sword that made empire eternal. It was the signature. Even revolutions couldn't escape bureaucracy. When monarchies fell, the paperwork remained. The French Revolution, for instance, burned symbols of nobility, but preserved the tax records. The clerks simply changed who they served. Ink, after all, is loyal to whoever holds the pen. In the 19th century, as machines appeared in factories, bureaucracy found its own machines. The typewriter, the filing cabinet, the rubber stamp. Each invention promised efficiency, but also multiplied the paperwork. For every form solved, another was born. And so the office, where once a quiet corner of the castle, became a world of its own. Rows of desks, endless paper, men in waistcoats and women in long skirts sorting, stamping, and stacking, a symphony of clicking keys and shuffling pages. It was, in its strange, methodical way, the rhythm of modern life. The great sociologist Max Weber would later call bureaucracy the iron cage. He meant that once the world discovered the power of paperwork, it could never escape it. The system became self-sustaining, thus endless, logical, and inhumanly calm. Every problem created a form. Every form created a rule. Every rule required a department to enforce it. And so, one page at a time, the human spirit was filed, sorted, and stamped. But to be fair, Weber also saw its genius. Bureaucracy was fairness without feeling, the closest thing humans had ever made to pure order. In theory, anyone could rise within it, not by birth or blood, but by following the system. It was dull but democratic, impersonal but dependable. The world traded passion for paperwork and gained predictability. By the early 20th century, the paper empire was unstoppable. Governments, banks, universities, hospitals, all became bureaucracies. The modern passport was born. Birth certificates, tax codes, driver's licenses. These small documents quietly defined who you were. It's strange, isn't it? You could be a farmer or a philosopher, a soldier or a singer, but on paper you were just a few lines of data. The same idea that began in medieval ledgers, reducing people to entries, now governed entire populations. And yet, bureaucracy also became the great preserver. Wars destroyed cities, but not always their archives. When the flames went out, the records remained. That's how we remember the forgotten, through receipts, signatures, and the quiet endurance of ink. Even the dreamers and inventors of the 20th century weren't free from it. Albert Einstein worked in a patent office before he became a scientist. Franz Kafka wrote his novels after long days in a bureaucratic insurance bureau, and Charles Dickens, before fame, was a clerk in a blacking warehouse, copying labels by hand one after another. Perhaps that's the secret. Bureaucracy, though dull, has always been the shadow of genius. It teaches patience. It forces observation. It slows the mind enough to notice details that faster lives overlook. In that sense, the clerks of the Middle Ages didn't just invent bureaucracy, they invented focus. Today, the empire of paper has become the empire of code. Forms are digital, files live in clouds, but the spirit remains the same. Every click, every field, every confirmation email, It's the same quiet ritual of record and rule. The medieval ledger has simply gone online. The quill has become a keyboard. The candle's flame replaced by a screen's glow. We are still the children of the scribes, still trying to make the world behave by writing it down. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. For all its frustrations, bureaucracy gives shape to life. It preserves history, binds promises, and keeps chaos from swallowing the edges of civilization. It's the hum of order beneath the noise. Somewhere deep in an archive or a server, your name lives. A line of data, like those old inked lines from the Exchequer or the Domesday Book. It's boring. It's beautiful. It's human. Because for all our dreams of freedom, we still trust the calm logic of paper. We still believe that if something is written somewhere in some quiet office, then maybe it's real. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of the tax collectors, the clerks, the scribes. Their slow, steady hands shaped the world we live in. They turned chaos into columns, memory into ink, life into record. Their legacy is not thrilling. It does not shine or sing, but it endures and as quietly as paper in the dark. It begins, as all good stories do, in the dark. Not the grand dark of castles or the mysterious dark of forests, but a humble, smoky darkness that glows from within. A forge. A single stubborn light in the heart of a medieval village. You can hear it before you see it. The slow rhythm of iron on iron. Clang. Pause. Clang. It's steady, patient, and strangely soothing. The sound of one man shaping a world built on repetition. Step closer, and you find him there. The blacksmith. He's not a hero or a knight or a priest. He doesn't appear in the great chronicles of kings or saints, but without him none of them could exist. The medieval smithy was part workshop, part temple. It smelled of smoke, sweat, and iron. In the center, a forge glowed red, a small pit filled with charcoal stoked by a leather bellows that wheezed like a sleeping animal. Nearby stood an anvil, smooth and pitted from years of use, surrounded by tools whose names were simple but sacred: hammer, tongs, punch, chisel. The blacksmith's life was one of endless repetition. Before dawn, he woke to relight the forge. Before dusk, he hammered his last piece. Every strike of his arm was a small act of creation, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. The villagers came to him for everything. The farmer whose plow blade had dulled, the soldier whose sword had bent in battle, the cooper who needed a new hoop for a barrel, the baker whose oven hinge had cracked. In the age before machines, one man's hammer kept the world from falling apart. But for all his importance, the blacksmith lived a humble, quiet life. He worked not in marble halls but in smoke-filled corners. His tools rusted, his clothes burned through, his hands calloused until they looked more like stone than skin. Yet there was a certain grace in the monotony, a meditative rhythm. To heat, to shape, to cool, to hammer, to file, to repeat. The same sequence, day after day, year after year. And somewhere in that cycle, the world itself was remade. If you were to stand beside him for a day, you'd see the beauty hidden in the boredom. He listens to the sound of metal, not its sight. A dull tone means the iron is too cold. A bright ringing means it's strong enough to hold its shape. His knowledge is not written, it's felt. The rhythm of his work is its own kind of music. When the hammer rises, the world waits. When it falls, the world reshapes. Every spark that flies from his anvil is a reminder that civilization runs not on grand ideas, but on tools. And every tool begins here, in this dark, glowing corner of the world. The medieval blacksmith was also, in a quiet way, a scientist. He experimented constantly, testing new alloys, new tempering methods, new ways of cooling or quenching iron. Without written formulas, he built knowledge through touch and memory. When he plunged red-hot steel into water, steam hissed and danced. He couldn't explain the physics of it, but he knew exactly when it was right. Too hot and the blade would warp. Too cool and it would shatter. He walked that fine line every day, somewhere between ruin and perfection. This was not glamour. It was patience. It was the art of doing one thing so well and for so long that the act itself became wisdom. By evening, the village would glow in the soft orange light of the forge. Children would stop by the open doorway to watch the sparks rise, tiny comets that vanished into smoke. For them, the blacksmith was both magician and machine. He turned fire and stone into plows, nails, locks, and blades. Things too ordinary to notice, yet too vital to live without. And when the day ended, he'd sit on a wooden stool, staring into the coals as they cooled. In that silence there was peace, a rare kind of contentment that came from knowing that every hammer strike, no matter how small, had mattered. But the world around him was changing. By the late Middle Ages, new ideas were beginning to spread, new ways to smelt, new metals to work with, new guilds forming in cities. The solitary village smith was becoming part of something larger, an industry. And though he didn't know it yet, his slow, steady rhythm would echo into the age of machines. Because when the first pistons pumped and the first factories roared, they didn't invent their own rhythm. They borrowed his. That same clang. Pause. Clang became the heartbeat of the industrial age. The blacksmith in his humble forge had unknowingly forged the future. As night deepens and the last coals die down, his hammer rests, but the world keeps turning because of him. Every hinge, every nail, every gate, every cartwheel, the quiet architecture of daily life, bears his touch. He may not be remembered in history books, but he is remembered in everything. And so as the village sleeps and smoke curls up into the stars, we are left with a single thought. In the glow of one forge, civilization was kept alive by one patient man and a single hammer that refused to rest. By the 13th century, the blacksmith's hammer had begun to echo beyond his humble forge. Cities were rising, stone by stone, beam by beam. And every beam needed an iron nail, every gate an iron hinge. Where once a single village smith worked alone, now dozens gathered together in towns bound by oath, skill, and secrecy. They called themselves guilds, not quite families, not quite armies, but something between, a brotherhood of craft. And among the guilds of tailors, masons, and weavers, one stood apart, the Guild of Smiths, the keepers of fire, the masters of metal. The blacksmith's life, once free and solitary, became part of a great system. You could no longer simply light a forge and call yourself a smith. You needed permission, apprenticeship, mastery, membership. To enter a guild meant years of quiet training, proving you could be trusted with the secrets of fire and steel. An apprentice began at the bottom, cleaning, fetching, learning by watching. For 7 years or more, he studied not from books, but from repetition. He learned how iron felt, how it smelled, how it sounded at different heats. He learned patience, silence, and respect for tools, for fire, and for the rhythm of labor. When at last he became a journeyman, he could travel, carrying a small chest of tools and his stamped letter of proof. He'd go from town to town, earning a few coins, building reputation. And one day, if his work was good enough, he'd stand before the guild masters with a masterpiece, a single perfect object, meant to prove he had learned everything. Only then could he open his own forge. It was, in a way, the first version of a modern degree, centuries before universities began awarding them. Skill was knowledge, repetition was education. But the guilds were more than trade unions. They were engines of innovation. In the shadows of cathedrals and castles, blacksmiths began to experiment with mechanics. A better hinge became a better gate. A sturdier plow meant better harvests. And then came something entirely new: the gear. At first, gears were simple: wooden teeth carved into wheels for watermills and clockworks. But blacksmiths soon began forging iron gears, harder and more precise. These small turning wheels would one day drive mills, presses, and clocks, the ancestors of machines. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution. The blacksmith was no longer just shaping metal. He was shaping motion. In the great towns of Flanders, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, smiths began to form sub-guilds: armorers, cutlers, locksmiths, gunsmiths. Each specialized in a single art, perfecting it until it became science. The armorer learned how to make plates curve just so, strong enough to stop a sword, light enough to move in. The locksmith invented ever more clever ways to protect property, small, intricate puzzles of iron and key. The cutler sharpened knives and swords so precisely that his work was prized by nobles and kings. Each was a craftsman, but also, unknowingly, an early engineer. If you walked through a city like Nuremberg or Florence in the 1400s, you could hear the sound of the future: the ring of anvils, the hiss of quenching, the grinding of files. Whole streets were filled with the smell of soot and steel. The guilds had turned craftsmanship into an ecosystem, a living network of skills, trades, and shared knowledge. Every smith knew 100 others, and together they made a machine that no king or priest had planned. A machine made of men. And in that slow, steady hum of hammers you could hear civilization itself taking shape. But progress, as always, came at a cost. Guilds protected their secrets fiercely. To reveal a new method to outsiders could mean exile, or worse. Innovation was slow, guarded, careful. It was the paradox of medieval craft. To preserve perfection, they had to resist change. So while blacksmiths perfected the old ways, new thinkers began looking for faster, larger, louder ones. They built water-powered forges, bellows driven by wheels, hammers raised and dropped by flowing rivers. The work that once took a man's arm could now be done by motion itself. The water hammer was born, an early machine that mimicked the smith's rhythm. And with it, the seeds of industry were quietly planted. The blacksmith's forge had given birth to its own mechanical child. Yet even as technology grew, the guilds kept their dignity. To them, metal was still sacred, a living thing that demanded care. They believed iron had moods. It could be tired, angry, brittle, or soft. It responded to rhythm, to respect. A careless strike could ruin it. A thoughtful one could turn it into beauty. It's hard not to see poetry in that. In every nail, every latch, every key, there was a kind of devotion, a patient belief that perfection was possible if you only struck long enough, slow enough, true enough, and perhaps that's why, even centuries later, the blacksmith's legacy still feels alive. Every engineer, every machinist, every tinkerer, they all owe something to those medieval men of fire. The first clockmaker was a smith. The first gunsmith, a smith. The first mechanic, the same. From the guild halls of the 14th century to the factories of the 18th, the hammer's rhythm never stopped. It just grew louder. By the time of the Renaissance, the world had begun to shift again. Kings now commissioned not just weapons, but machines. Leonardo da Vinci sketched gears, pulleys, and springs, all based on the tools of blacksmiths. In workshops from Venice to Vienna, metalworkers experimented with presses, lathes, and mills, the grandfathers of engines, and so, what began in the dim forge of a village became the mechanical heartbeat of the modern world. The blacksmith had become the ancestor of the engineer. As the bells of evening ring and the hammers finally rest, there's a strange quiet over the city, a silence that feels full, not empty. Every tool on every bench glows faintly from the day's work. The air smells of iron and ash, and in that stillness you realize progress never begins with noise. It begins here in small hands doing small things over and over until something changes. So as the embers die, one question lingers in the smoke. Did the blacksmith ever know what he was building? That his forge would one day become a factory, and his hammer a machine? By the dawn of the 18th century, the world had changed its tempo. The quiet rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer, once the pulse of every town, was drowned out by a new sound. The rumble of engines, the hiss of steam, the roar of factories. The age of industry had begun, and for the blacksmith, it was the beginning of the end. For centuries, he had been the master of metal, the keeper of the forge, the shaper of all things useful. But now, machines were learning his craft. Water, hammers, steam hammers, mechanical presses, each struck faster and stronger than any human arm. Iron could now be smelted in tons, rolled into sheets, cut into bolts by the thousands. Where once one man had made a nail, now a factory made a million. The blacksmith, who had forged the world, was slowly being replaced by it. In towns across Europe, old forges fell silent. The glow that had once guided travelers home at night flickered and died. You could still find a smith or two in the countryside, repairing wagon wheels, mending plows, shoeing horses. But even that work began to fade, as machines replaced horses too. A profession that had endured for nearly 2,000 years was quietly disappearing, and yet, not entirely. Something strange happened in those last smithies. As the industrial world rushed forward, the remaining blacksmiths began to take their time. No longer burdened by necessity, their craft became something else, an art. They made ornamental gates, delicate scrollwork, railings, and lamps. They forged not for survival, but for beauty. The same patience that once made tools now shaped artistry. Their work, once considered boring, became suddenly admired, the same way we admire the sound of a clock in a world filled with noise. In this new age of machines, people began to look back with longing. Factories made everything faster, cheaper, easier, but not better. The blacksmith's touch, his slow perfection, had a warmth no machine could replicate. Iron from a forge had a soul. Iron from a factory had a number. It was as though the world had traded its heartbeat for efficiency. Still, in small towns and quiet corners, the blacksmith remained. Not a relic, but a reminder. You could find him in a shed behind a farmhouse, his forge made from old bricks, his tools worn smooth by decades of use. His hands were scarred and dark with soot. He didn't need blueprints or manuals. He worked by memory, by feel. He'd take a strip of glowing iron, bend it with tongs, strike it twice, listen to the sound, adjust, a symphony of instinct that no machine could imitate. He didn't rush. He didn't innovate. He simply worked, the same way his ancestors had for 1,000 years. And in that quiet repetition, something eternal remained. The blacksmith's legacy survived not in his tools, but in what he taught humanity. He taught us the rhythm of progress, slow, patient, deliberate. He taught us that creation comes from heat, pressure, and time. He taught us that even the dullest labor can shape something extraordinary. Every factory, every engine, every skyscraper owes its existence to his hammer. Every engineer still echoes his discipline, every craftsman his patience, every machine his rhythm. In the clang of pistons and the hum of gears, you can still hear the ghost of that hammer, steady, slow, certain. When the Industrial Revolution roared across the world, many thought the blacksmith's time had ended, but in truth, it had only changed form. The forges turned into foundries, the anvils became assembly lines, and the blacksmith's hammer, his ancient, faithful tool, became the symbol of industry itself. Look at any emblem of progress, crossed hammers, cogwheels, ironworks, and you'll see it there. His spirit, preserved in steel. Even now in the 21st century, the blacksmith's art endures, not as necessity but as meditation. In workshops and studios, people return to the forge not to make a living, but to remember something the modern world forgot. That creation requires patience. They heat the metal, strike it slowly, breathe with the rhythm. They lose themselves in that timeless sound. Clang, pause, clang. And for a moment, they understand what every smith before them knew. That the world may change, but the act of making and that deep silent dialogue between fire and hand will never disappear. As the last ember fades, imagine a world without blacksmiths. No nails, no hinges, no tools, no machines. It's unthinkable. They were the unseen architects of civilization. Their names may be lost, their forges forgotten, but their work lives on in every bridge, every engine, every bolt of steel that holds our world together. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, listen for that old rhythm in the hum of your world. It's there, in the rumble of a train, the click of a key, the pulse of your own heart. It's the sound of creation, ancient, patient, human. The blacksmith's hammer never truly stopped. It simply found a new world to shape. If you stood in the middle of a medieval field at dawn, you would hear the world breathing. Not loudly, not in the way cities do, but softly, through the wind brushing over grain, the caw of distant crows, the gentle creak of a cartwheel on wet soil. It is not a scene that makes history books. There are no kings here, no knights, no banners, no wars, only the farmer, bent-backed, mud-streaked, silent, and the earth that has become his life. For most of human history, this was the world. Not castles, but cottages. Not swords, but shovels. The life of a farmer was slow, repetitive, and exhausting, and yet it was the one constant that held civilization together. Every bread loaf in a king's hall, every sack of grain in a merchant's ship, every pint of ale in a tavern, all began here in the dull routine of dawn and dirt. The medieval peasant worked by seasons, not clocks. Spring meant plowing and sowing. Summer meant weeding and watching. Autumn meant harvest, back-breaking, endless days of cutting, binding, threshing. Winter meant repair and waiting, and praying the stored grain would last until spring returned. There were no shortcuts, no miracles, only patience. The plow was their sword, and the ox their comrade. A single field, carefully tilled, could feed a family. But one bad storm, one poor harvest, one swarm of insects could destroy everything. And yet somehow they endured. What's most remarkable about these farmers is not their suffering, but their persistence. They built whole systems to manage the chaos of nature. Quiet, clever systems that lasted centuries. One of them was called the three-field rotation. Simple, almost boring, yet revolutionary. Instead of exhausting one field year after year, farmers divided the land into 3 parts. One for wheat or rye, one for oats or barley, and one left fallow to rest. Each year, they rotated the crops. It meant less grain now, but more in the long run. It was patience turned into science. The result? More food, healthier soil, fewer famines, a quiet agricultural revolution, not shouted in courts or written in chronicles, but whispered across fields. Still, the farmer's life was harsh. Taxes took much of what they grew. The church demanded tithes, 1/10 of everything. The Lord demanded labor, days spent repairing his roads or mending his walls. After everyone else had taken their share, what remained barely fed the farmer's own family. But here's the quiet secret. Though they were at the bottom of society, the farmers held more power than anyone realized. When they worked, the world turned. When they didn't, it stopped. A king might own land, but only the peasant knew how to make it live. Only he understood the moods of the earth, when to sow, when to rest, when to pray for rain. He might not wear a crown, but he was the keeper of the real kingdom, the one beneath his feet. There was beauty, too, hidden in the monotony. The smell of fresh hay after rain, the shimmer of dew on young wheat, the low hum of bees drifting between wildflowers at the field's edge. These were the small, quiet luxuries of a life lived close to the ground. No gold, no feasts, but a deep, constant intimacy with the world itself. When the farmer planted a seed, he was making a promise he might not live to see fulfilled. But he planted anyway, because someone must. In the evenings, the village gathered. Men with cracked hands and aching backs, women with baskets of vegetables, children with twigs in their hair. They'd share bread, ale, and stories, not of heroes or saints, but of weather, of tools, of which patch of land had yielded best that year. They laughed softly, they worried quietly, and they went to sleep early. Not because they wanted to, but because dawn came fast. It was not a grand life, but it was steady, predictable. And in a world filled with war and famine and plague, that steadiness was its own kind of victory. Yet beneath all that dull routine was something extraordinary. Knowledge. Generations of it passed down not through books, but through hands. When to plant by the moon, how to store seed through a harsh winter, which weeds signaled healthy soil, and which warned of rot. The world's greatest civilizations were built on this invisible wisdom, the dull, detailed, careful memory of the earth. By the end of the Middle Ages, this knowledge had spread like sunlight. Villages connected through trade, markets grew busier, grain became currency, and the boring work of peasants became the backbone of empires. It was the ultimate irony that the people least remembered by history had quietly fed it. So as the stars rise over a medieval field, and the last farmer lays down his hoe, you realize something strange. Civilization didn't begin in palaces. It began here, in silence, in soil, and in the slow rhythm of those who never stopped planting. By the time Europe began to rebuild from the chaos of the early Middle Ages, the farmers had already been working, quietly, endlessly, for generations. They did not march into cities or write great treatises, but their hands built the foundations of the new world one furrow at a time. It is strange to think about how much history owes to a single piece of wood and iron, the heavy plow. Before it, northern Europe was a swampy wilderness. The old Roman plows could not cut through its thick, damp soil. But around the 8th century, Someone, no one knows exactly who, attached a curved iron blade to a sturdy wooden frame, added a wheel or two, and suddenly the land opened up. Fields that had lain untouched for centuries became productive. Villages grew, populations swelled, and for the first time, Europe could feed itself again. It was not a war or a royal decree that made it happen. It was the quiet ingenuity of people who wanted to coax more from the earth. But as harvests grew larger, another problem appeared. What to do with all that grain? Grinding it by hand with a quernstone, a flat rock, and a heavy upper stone was brutally slow work. A single family could spend hours grinding enough flour for just one day's bread. Then came another stroke of dull brilliance: the watermill. At first it was simple, a wheel turned by a stream, connected to a set of gears that spun the millstones. But it changed everything. Where one person could grind a few kilos a day, a mill could grind hundreds. By the 11th century, watermills dotted the countryside like sentinels of progress. Later came windmills, rising like wooden giants across the flat plains. Their creaking arms turned the sky itself into labor. These inventions were not glamorous. They did not glitter, they did not conquer, but they bought people time. And time in a medieval world was the rarest form of freedom. Freedom, however, came at a cost. Mills were often owned by lords or monasteries, not by the peasants who used them. The local mill became a symbol of quiet oppression, because even if you grew your own wheat, you still had to pay to grind it. Every bag of flour carried a toll, a small reminder that even the bread you baked belonged in part to someone else. Many peasants, desperate to keep what they could, built illegal hand mills, little querns hidden in barns or behind cottages. Church records call this crime milling in secret, and the punishment could be severe. But people did it anyway. Imagine the scene. A family huddled in a candle-lit room, grinding grain in whispers, listening for the sound of boots on the road. Each rotation of the stone a tiny act of defiance. It was not rebellion with swords or banners. It was rebellion in rhythm. A revolution that turned slowly with the wheel of a mill. Around the same time, another quiet shift began: the rise of the commons. Not every inch of land belonged to a lord. Every village had shared spaces, open fields, meadows, and forests, where people grazed their animals, gathered firewood, or fished. These common lands were lifelines. They kept poor families alive when crops failed or taxes rose. But as lords grew richer, they began to enclose these land, building fences, digging ditches, marking ownership where none had existed before. The peasants lost their safety net, and that's when murmurs began, low, uncertain, but persistent. The chronicles of the time speak of unrest and troublemakers, but what really happened was quieter. Villagers refused to leave the commons. They cut down the lord's fences at night. They grazed their sheep where they always had. It wasn't a war. It was a slow, stubborn refusal to disappear. By the late 14th century, these small acts of defiance began to echo across Europe. In England, when taxes rose and wages fell, entire villages marched, not to conquer, but to be heard. The most famous of these, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, began with something deceptively simple: the demand for fairness. Farmers, bakers, millers, and craftsmen, ordinary anonymous people, filled the roads to London. They carried no polished armor, no royal banners. Their weapons were sticks, pitchforks, hammers. Their voices hoarse but steady. They spoke of freedom from serfdom, of fair rents, of the right to live by their own labor. and for a brief moment, they were heard. King Richard II met them, a teenager, standing before thousands of his subjects. He promised reforms, he promised mercy, but promises are light things easily scattered by the wind. Days later, the revolt was crushed, leaders were executed, villages burned, and yet something had changed. The peasants went back to their fields. They sowed again, reaped again, lived again. But their silence was no longer the silence of obedience. It was the silence of endurance, the kind that waits, the kind that remembers. In the centuries that followed, their children and grandchildren would continue to shape the land, not with rebellion but with the slow, steady progress of better tools, fairer trade, and growing self-respect. Because power, once questioned, never fully returns to its old form. So when you picture the medieval farmer now, don't imagine only mud and sweat. Imagine invention. Imagine quiet rebellion. Imagine a people who learned how to turn wood and water into freedom, and how to whisper change through the hum of a mill. The next time you walk past an old stone mill by a river, listen closely. You might still hear it, the rhythm of that forgotten defiance, turning endlessly through time. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe's landscape had changed, but its heartbeat still came from the fields. Cities were growing, trade was booming, and ships were crossing oceans. But every loaf of bread, every mug of ale, every meal that sustained the New World still began in the same quiet place. A stretch of dirt and the patient work of someone tending it. The dull gardener, once invisible, had become the unspoken engineer of progress. When people speak of the Renaissance, they talk about artists and thinkers, Leonardo sketching machines, Galileo gazing at stars, Michelangelo shaping marble into gods. But behind all that brilliance was something humbler, food stability. You cannot have painters and scientists without farmers. A society that eats well can afford to think. And for the first time in centuries, Europe was eating better than ever before. The innovations that once seemed minor, the heavy plow, the crop rotation, the watermill, had quietly multiplied abundance. And abundance did something revolutionary. It freed people's time. Some left the villages to seek fortunes in towns. Others became craftsmen, millers, brewers, blacksmiths. The farmer's field had become the seedbed of a new economy. Yet, as always, progress came with tension. Land was wealth, and now more people wanted it. The enclosure movement, which had begun centuries earlier, accelerated. Lords and merchants fenced off vast tracts of once common land to graze sheep for wool, a commodity that Europe's new markets devoured. For the villagers who had depended on those commons for survival, it was like losing the earth itself. They protested. Quietly at first, letters, petitions, songs of complaint. Then, as the fences rose higher, they began to tear them down. By the 17th century, whole communities were displaced. Families who had farmed the same soil for generations were forced into towns or onto the roads. The countryside grew emptier. The cities grew louder. And from this slow displacement came something that no one expected: industrial labor. The same people who once harvested wheat began tending machines. The rhythm of the plow became the rhythm of the factory. It was the next stage of the same story, the transformation of work. The dull gardener had not vanished. He had simply moved indoors. He traded his field for a workshop, his ox for a gear, his seasons for shifts. But the patience, the endurance, the quiet discipline, those remained. The Industrial Revolution, often credited to inventors and investors, was also built on the mindset of farmers: routine, repetition, and resilience. The same spirit that once guided the rotation of crops now guided the rotation of machines. And yet, in the background, the earth itself remembered. As industrial cities grew smoky and crowded, thinkers began to look back toward the soil, writers, scientists, and reformers, people like Jethro Tull, Arthur Young, and later Eustace von Liebig, realized that the future still depended on what happened in the ground beneath our feet. Tull's seed drill of the 1700s, Liebig's studies of soil chemistry in the 1800s, these were the children of that same ancient curiosity. The same question whispered across centuries. How can we make the land live again? It was as if the memory of the medieval field had taken root in modern science. Even now, the legacy of those forgotten farmers surrounds you. Every loaf of bread on your table, every bag of flour in your kitchen, every field stretching beyond the highway. They are all descendants of the boring routines of the past. The way we rotate crops, the way we irrigate, the way we store and distribute food, each system carries the fingerprints of someone who once plowed with wooden tools and sang quietly to the rhythm of the seasons. Their story never made it into grand histories because it was too ordinary, too slow, too steady. But perhaps that is the point, because not every revolution begins with fire or fanfare. Some begin with patience. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of hooves in mud, the creak of cartwheels, the soft sigh of the wind brushing over barley. This was history's first great machine, the earth and the human hand. And though the world has changed, though cities glow where fields once stood, we still depend on that ancient rhythm. Every harvest, every meal, every act of planting something new is a quiet conversation with those who came before us, a promise continued. The dull gardeners are gone, but their work remains alive in every patch of soil that still grows something. They never ruled, they never conquered, they never commanded armies. And yet they won the longest war of all, the war against hunger. They fed empires. They fed the future, and through the slow, steady turning of their tools, they taught humanity the greatest truth of all, that real progress does not shout. It hums softly through the fields. And that brings our quiet journey to an end. From the fields that fed empires to the forgotten hands that shaped the world, tonight we've wandered through the soft corners of history where patience built more than power ever could. If your eyes are heavy now, let them rest. The past will keep turning just like it always has, and slowly, gently, endlessly. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.